Welcome, everyone. We are back with Chris Cutrone for the third or fourth time now on the channel. And today we're going to talk about the new article for Sublation magazine that Chris just published called, I think it's a call for socialist unity. And it's been
Socialist
making the
Unity.
socialist unity, exclamation point. It's been making the rounds. There seems to be possibly some reactions to it in different corners of the left. And we're going to talk about what it means and why socialist unity. So, Chris, why don't you, well, first of all, welcome. Thanks for coming.
Hey.
What is socialist unity and why now?
Okay, so why now? Let's deal with that first because I was originally solicited to write this article several months back. So it wasn't about this Zoran Mamdani candidacy in the New York mayoral race. Um, and it was an attempt to kind of restate 10 years later, the approach that I've been charting with my campaign for a socialist party, which I started in 2015, wrote 11 theses on in 2016, and those are appended to this article. So I didn't want to restate those or even really update them. I just wanted to give a kind of general orientation for what the project is about. And what I'll say about that, it's something that we did that was in some ways original, like immediately sidetracked by the Bernie campaign, which hadn't happened yet. And the squad election was a little bit for the campaign for a socialist party because I think that that also was confusing for people. And then we went into hibernation in the COVID years and then have come out of it in the last couple of years slowly but surely. And it's something that so the campaign for a socialist party is something in the United States but is also going on elsewhere. So it's also going on in the UK and Germany and Austria. So, but it was originally conceived of as, Campaign for a Socialist Party in the United States. And it was really predicated on the assumption that Hillary would just take over from Obama and that the left would go into a kind of a quiet period and that we would try to take advantage of that lack of ideological chum in the water, to do some actual organizing. That's kind of where it started, but now we've come full circle. And in the meantime, the millennial left, really, to my mind, died because it liquidated into the Democratic Party in a profound way around the Bernie campaign. And then in a continuing way with the squad election and the expansion of the squad in 2020 with Biden's election, and, has sort of carried on, maybe now reinvigorated by Trump's reelection, and then the Zoran Mamdani campaign seems to have shown some kind of viability for this electoral road to reforming the Democrats in a more quote unquote socialist direction. So really it's something, very different from any of that. So the real question is what's socialism, and I kind of avoid that. I avoid getting into that because I see the campaign for a socialist party and my call for socialist unity to be pre-political. And in that way, it doesn't really bear a lot of like publicity, like media exposure. Like it's not seeking that. It's a kind of more grassroots and almost underground kind of phenomenon in terms of the organizing that we have done. And the issues I should say that the campaign has worked on are immigrant worker rights, police brutality, and also tenants' rights. So those are the areas that we've worked on in our various locations, um, with tenants' rights taking prominence in the COVID period, especially. And so, it's
So these
about
are all being worked
training
on in the
ourselves.
background, kind of without any publicity.
That's right. Yeah, because it's really about training ourselves as organizers. And so it's a very different side of me, meaning, I am like the hyper intellectual Marxist interested in all sorts of theoretical and philosophical esoterica. This is something entirely different. This is the other piece. So it's not the theory piece, it's the practice piece. And so in that way, it's an unfamiliar side of me. It's also something that I consider doing under a pseudonym.
Mm.
I considered doing it under like a party name type pseudonym when I first launched it. And I also thought about keeping it secret from Platypus, even, right? But I didn't take that route. In other words, I actually went to Platypus and got permission from them to do it.
Well, how would you
And
even go about organizing without anybody knowing who you are?
oh, in the way that one has to organize generally, meaning you have to sort of show up with what people are doing now already. So you have to engage like the religious and liberal NGO world that's already active on the ground on various issues. Clearly, on those issues, people are already doing a lot of work on police brutality, on immigrant worker rights, and on tenant organizing.
Hmm.
So it's not about like starting from scratch or something. It's about getting a lay of the land. And it's based on my assumption that a lot of civil social organizing, that field is really kind of uh, empty, meaning a lot of it is sucked into, like in the United States, the Democratic Party orbit, or already in a kind of apolitical or depoliticized, like religious context. But it also, there's a lot that's neglected. So even though it seems totally colonized by existing NGOs, it's also a completely open field in another respect, especially in terms of socialists, like what socialists would be interested in doing there and how socialists would handle it differently than the liberals or the religious NGOs, the churches. Like I said, a completely different thing. It's something that I think the left has been neglectful of, the hard left, the Marxist left, the socialist left, the communist left, not the left in terms of the liberal left or the progressive liberal left. Since I would say the 80s. In other words, I think that the 60s New Left had a phase. They had two phases. They had a kind of early to mid 1960s phase, and then they had a 70s phase where they did a lot of grassroots organizing. But then in the Reagan era, it really dried up very profoundly. It still went on at some very minimal level with like anarchists and those kinds of mutual aid kind of socialist kind of initiatives. But
Hmm.
otherwise, the new left got sucked into the Democratic Party aligned NGO world, the long march through the institutions, including the labor unions, organized labor as it presently exists. It's something that one saw in the 30s, certainly, and then again in the 60s and 70s. But there are periods where it's relatively quiet. In the 50s, a lot was done through the civil rights movement, which is a kind of a model also. And then, of course, in the original historical Marxist world of the turn of the 20th century, like the late 1800s, early 1900s, that whole socialist movement, the Socialist International, the socialist parties like Eugene Debs' party, the SPD in Germany, were all based on a massive uh, civil society organizing of the working class in all aspects of life, not just labor unions, but also all sorts of social clubs, women's organizations, youth clubs, athletic leagues,
Mm.
music societies, just everything. Um, because of course the working class doesn't have that for itself. In other words, the working class, just subsists on the sort of capitalist institutions, but needs those kinds of self-organizing institutions in order to really have the possibility of a socialist politics. So that's at least the premise. The premise is that so even campaign for a socialist party potentially misleading because it's not like declaring a socialist party. I think when people hear party, they hear two things that are very different but also related, like electoralism in capitalist politics, electoral initiatives trying to get elected to office within the capitalist political sphere,
Hmm.
or propaganda groups like quote unquote parties that are not parties, that are just little propaganda sects, right? And so
So
that's
what would make what's the difference between a propaganda sect and the ones that exist now and what this would look like?
well, we would not be based on like the unity. So the socialist unity that I'm calling for here is not based on an ideological agreement or immediately on what people would think of as a programmatic agreement, meaning to include people, potentially at least, who have very different positions on things. So, just in recent years, like in the post-COVID era, what has been my fantasy, my kind of dream scenario for this project? The dream scenario for this project would be that it would include people who are disaffected with and drifting away from the DSA, who realize that it's not what they thought it would be, that it's not, they thought it would be something other than just an electoral vehicle for the Democrats. Um, it would include, I would love to include as many people on the avowed socialist, communist, Marxist, and even anarchist left as possible, but in organizing, in learning how to be organizers and do this kind of civil social action. So MAGA, the MAGA communists, like that whole ACP milieu, like everybody, right? Like really everybody. And really, it's a little bit of a throwing down the gauntlet, meaning put your money where your mouth is. Are you going to do something? Are you going to train yourselves to be something other than propagandists? And, just have this schismatic, constant argument over Marxism. So it goes back to something that you and I talked about in the past, which is putting Marxism in the back pocket. And we can't lead with Marxism. And really, Marxism would have to earn its place again. It would have to earn its purpose, its rationale. But even the claim to be socialist, so one of the things I write about in this article is that even socialists, like, are we even socialists? Really?
What
And
makes
so
us socialist? What would make us socialist?
um, if we are organizing the working class in such a way that it could actually contend for social and political power, that could actually, in a practical way, have any hope of overcoming capitalism.
All the sects and all the groups right now would probably say, "Oh, we're doing that. We're just at the beginning. We're at the bottom of the stairs."
They've been there for 100 years. I would say all of it. Like, in other words, the Communist Party USA from the beginning never got really off the ground. It was not what the old Socialist Party before that was. Did not achieve what the old Socialist Party was able to achieve. And, certainly none of the spin-off organizations
Mm.
from either the socialist or communist parties ever amounted to anything in the United States, but also I would make that claim elsewhere. Meaning, again, there are certain assumptions here, which is that trying to address something that's been missing for a long time, and that in the meantime is filled in by others, but is really, the field lies fallow. It's really an unplowed field of action. Right. So I think that, like, for instance, we've talked about like Trotskyism, and you had me on with Alex Grant. We had a
Hmm.
kind of debate about that. You know, Trotsky assumed that there was a constituted working class movement for socialism in the 1930s. I would say maybe there's some reason to doubt that even back then, but that was much more plausible. But after World War II, no. And the mass socialist and communist parties after World War II were really progressive capitalist parties. They were very much uh, sharing power with the capitalist state. There was a modus vivendi, in France and elsewhere. And of course, labor only truly came to power in the UK after World War II in any sustained way. And it ostensibly had a socialist clause, but no, right? This was even below what the Labour Party had ever been previously, by the time it became, a player in capitalist politics. So, certainly the SPD after World War II in Germany, after the Nazi era, is something entirely different. I would argue that they were New Deal parties. They were not any longer socialist or communist parties. They were part of
The
the global
SPD.
New Deal. Yeah. And the French socialist and communist parties. Right. So, um, insofar as they became real political parties, they were capitalist parties. Insofar as they did not participate in capitalist politics, they became propaganda sects. So that's a kind of rough and ready way of thinking about where the left has been for 100 years.
And what do you make of the new left Corbyn party? And the fact that the biggest communist organization in the UK right now, the IMT, the RCP, the Grantites, they've just put out a statement calling for entryism into
Sure,
this
of
party.
course. Into this party rather than into the Labour Party.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, the crisis of the Labour Party, meaning, we might suffer whiplash, right? So going from Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party to Keir Starmer,
Hmm.
it's would seem to be night and day, on all sorts of issues.
Right.
And yet it's the same Labour Party, right? So whatever illusions people might have had in Jeremy Corbyn transforming the Labour Party, that wasn't going to happen because Jeremy Corbyn was a neoliberal politician, just as Bernie Sanders was, meaning they were elected from neoliberal constituencies, Vermont, and Corbyn's constituency was also a kind of, gentrified, yuppie London neoliberal constituency.
So it couldn't have
It
been
was not
otherwise.
Could not have been otherwise. Right. So what we're dealing with now is a pressure tactic to reform the Labour Party. That's what the New Left
That's what they
Party
really
is.
want.
Yeah, of course. Right. So there's still the Trades Union Congress, as a base for the Labour Party. So, these kinds of efforts are spoiler party efforts, meaning they're trying to punish and force reform of the party that they really should be in, but are just not, because Jeremy Corbyn was purged.
Yeah.
A Galloway had been purged. So, these people had, more or less voluntarily, involuntarily departed the Labour Party. And so they want the old Labour Party back. They want the Tony Benn Labour Party back.
Yes, right,
But that's
right.
not happening.
Yeah, the good laborites.
Yeah.
The accused of Cliffite, right?
Who?
Tony Benn.
Galloway? Oh, Ben. He was under some kind of influence, but not, I don't know if he was directly a cadre. I think that he was just in the kind of general alliance, like he was in some kind of, United
Hmm.
Front, Popular Front. It's going back to like 1983. What we're talking about is that where the millennial left has ended up is in trying to do pre-neoliberalism.
Right.
So, they want to take us back to pre-Tony Blair, pre-Bill Clinton, Democratic Party, Labor Party. That's what they want.
My entire university career in as a politics major was about teaching me why that was the golden age that we need to get back. We lost something from switching to this neoliberal era.
No. Meaning the problems are different, but they were formidable. Meaning, it's a wash whether things are better or worse then and now with respect to the task of socialism. That's the hard
Hmm.
part, right? So what do people want? Do people want a reform of capitalism or do they want socialism? What do they really want? And what are we working towards? Because the other thing that I'll say about this is that I don't expect this to pay off in my lifetime. It's going to take decades to build an actual socialist movement and political party that could contend for power. And that process will affect capitalism and capitalist politics in particular. It will. But, you know, it's not aimed at capitalist reforms.
I don't think
It's
that,
not aimed at harm reduction, whatever people, whatever like debased, like, just think about how abject it's all become. Stop the killing, harm reduction, right? Stop the genocide.
Mhm.
No, we're not going to be able to do that. We're not going to be able to stop the next three genocides. No.
What does it mean to forgo working out what we mean by socialism and even capitalism in advance?
It means that, I've been around the block a few times now, on the Marxism question and on the socialism question and on the capitalism question. People are not clear about what the essence of capitalism is, and therefore they're not clear on what needs to be overcome, and therefore they're not clear about socialism. And of course, the last 20 years have been the period of the millennial left, and it's been about the crisis of neoliberalism and the
Right.
emergence of a kind of post-neoliberalism, which has been mistaken for the end of capitalism per se. Like we can chuckle about it now in 2025, but capitalism has been declared in terminal crisis several times in the last 20 years.
Well, also in the last, century and a half.
The older left was more careful about that. They were.
Right, but there was at least a period in the, I don't know, the early 20th
30s?
century where even the capitalists, the bourgeois were worried that things were on the like things weren't going to go well for them.
They're already worried. They're always worried. They will continue to be worried, meaning they're aware of, capitalism in that sense, in the sense of things that they have to do, things that don't work, you know. Now different because we're not looking for the capitalists to do this or that. We're not worried the way they're worried. Like they're worried about maintaining capitalism in a way that is not our concern, right? I mean, again, we have to sort of disabuse ourselves. We have to disenthrall ourselves from the slave power and realize that a lot of this is just not our concern as socialists. Capitalist policy.
So
So
what's
capitalist policy, they argue with each other and they will kill each other over. They will, right? They'll have civil wars over what capitalist policy should be. They'll have international wars over what capitalist policy should be. But that's just not our concern.
so what does a since we're swimming in capitalist politics even in on the left and in social in socialist parties and organizations. So what does a socialist politics look like to the eyes of some of leftists who are in this world now steeped in capitalist politics?
Okay, so here's a, handy definition of politics. So politics is organizing people to affect or assert power over the course of human events. Socialist politics is about directing that towards overcoming capitalism. Do we have that power? We're now thinking about things 100 years after various attempts to overcome capitalism that have failed, right? It's not like we're still trying. It's not like, oh, China is still trying. No, no. Vietnam's still trying. No. Cuba's still trying. No. North Korea's still trying. No, they're not. They're not trying to get to socialism. They're not. They're trying to survive in a capitalist world. That's all they're trying to do. They're barely hanging on. They are capitalists. They are part of the capitalist world. So it didn't happen. Right? We have to face that reality. Okay. So we're really, at square one. It's not like we can like learn, oh, don't put pig iron factories in every village, right? It's not like, oh, we know that the Great Leap Forward didn't work, and so we won't do that, right? No, I mean, this is just not what we're talking about. And, we're not talking about people protecting themselves against the ravages or cycles of global capitalism. We're not talking about like parts of the developing world like shielding themselves more or less against suffering the worst consequences of capitalism. We're not. We're talking about core capitalist countries, right? The 60% of the world economy that has signed up for trade deals with Trump, right? Um, 60 plus percent now. I guess it was 60% maybe even before the EU deal. It was something crazy, right? And it's like that's what you need. You need power there to affect the course of human events, to affect capitalism, to
Power in the
affect,
United States.
yeah, United States, Europe, Canada. Canada will go along with whatever the US does. It won't necessarily go along with whatever Europe does, but it will go along with whatever the US does. And Japan. I always like to joke Oceania, Airstrip One, the UK, Australia, New Zealand. Like,
Mm.
but South Korea,
Hmm.
Japan, India, capitalist country, capitalism, you know. So, you know, and they're all connected. And obviously, whatever we do will have an effect in China. It will have an effect in China. It will. So, we just have to be, we have to, we have to explore what the possibilities are at a fundamental level for organizing the working class into an independent social and political force. And understand that that will affect things. And that will have a logic of its own. In other words, insofar as it is successful, it will actually create further necessities. I mean,
Right.
I guess the point now is it's not clear, apart from like climate change or whatever, you know, why do we need to overcome capitalism again? Why?
Well,
What's the
that's
problem
a
with
great question because
it? You know,
let me say what the RCP, because they're my old Trotskyist organization, so I have a forever connection to them.
right.
Just recently, talking about the need to join in to the new left party in the UK, says capitalism has failed and communism is a system based on need and profit, and because of that, because it will provide
Need not
housing.
profit, right.
Right, need not profit, right? Because it will provide housing, because it will provide free education and healthcare. That's why we need
So it's just a
communism.
goodie basket. It's just a laundry list of
Treats.
demands. That's what socialism is.
Yeah, we get nice things.
Socialism is, yeah, why can't we have nice things? I think that that was some language that the DS Jacobin people used, you know, and in the day. And no, I mean, no, not what we're talking about. Meaning, we're talking about, again, a political transformation, a social transformation, a social revolution,
But why?
a political revolution, a social revolution. Exactly why. Well, because so I was just teaching Marx this summer, an academic course, a kind of crash course. It's my Marx and Marxism boot camp, and it's clear that Marx thought that the Industrial Revolution led directly to communism.
Hmm.
It didn't.
No.
So we've, for the last 100 years, 150 years, since Marx's time, we've been having to deal with a situation that not in the original conception of things by Marx and also other contemporary socialists of his, which is capitalism. Capitalism. Right? But we also know what capitalism is in a way that they did not, meaning we know its tremendous wastefulness and destructiveness. We know the
Tremendous.
kind of the cost benefit. We know the political price that's been paid. We know the degradation of, democracy and liberalism. We know a lot of barbarism. Socialism or barbarism. We know a lot of barbarism. We've been down the barbarism highway for a long time now. And it's engulfed the left as well. It's engulfed actually existing socialism, the barbarism. We have many examples of barbarism. Um, so, but again, in terms of being more precise about what will it take for us to overcome those conditions of barbarism, that's less clear. So to declare that capitalism has failed, it has not. In other words, it's not failed now any more than it's failed in the past.
Yeah, it never promised really anything
Well,
to any
there's
of us.
that. That's true. That's true. That is true, right? Capitalism doesn't promise us anything. Um, right. I mean, there are different levels to the problem, meaning capitalist politicians promise people things.
Yes.
Capitalism doesn't promise anyone anything. Um, Now, does socialism promise people anything? No. Socialism or communism is just the task of overcoming
Mm,
this problem we've been in that has not been there for hundreds of years or thousands of years, but it's been there for 200 years. Right? It's very specific, right? The contours of the modern world. But again, what that means in practice, like that's again to get back to it. It's easy for us to go do a theoretical view, but looked at practically, what actually does it mean? Meaning, in what way can the working class, can it and must it build up its social and political power to be able to overcome capitalism? That's the question mark. I think that people look for short circuits instead.
hmm
Meaning, I think again, I have certain assumptions, and they're not like ethical, moral assumptions. They're more historical assumptions based on history. That if I gave a convincing TED talk at Davos, convinced everyone of the truth of Marxism and the need to overcome capitalism and establish communism,
Right.
and they all went home and started trying to do it, they would not be able to.
No.
And the impediment to them doing so would be the working class. The working class would want capitalism against their communism. Even if I spelled it perfectly and they tried to implement it
Mm.
perfectly, the working class would resist it.
So how do socialists work with the working class that is going to work to keep capitalism afloat necessarily?
Right. So we have to organize the working class in such a way as to make the necessity of socialism a practical manifest, meaning there's a logic, meaning once the working class starts to take responsibility for things, it entails other problems that they will face.
So the taking responsibility part is the kind of step one instead of being looked after.
That's right. Well, certainly there's that. So I think that, I mean, look, obviously the left has been very like agonized over this question of, oh, are we PMC? Are we a managerial elite? Yes, that's true. That's what the left is. Meaning the left wants to be the better guardians of the workers and other poor people and other oppressed people, right? So, I think that generally speaking, the left looks at things in terms of if they were in charge instead of the capitalist politicians, then things would be better. Um, and that's just not the way things are or are going to be. Meaning, Um, the left is not going to just, as it is now, take power. That's not going to happen. Even if it were to happen, it wouldn't be what's necessary. It wouldn't be what's needed. But it's not going to happen, and
So
we
if
shouldn't be
if
thinking
let's
that way.
so if the if let's say if the campaign for Socialist Party, some billionaire gave them, I don't know, felt nice and gave them several $1 billion, and they ran a successful marketing campaign and got elected to president.
Uh-huh. No,
Doug
no way.
Lane
Yeah, it
and Chris
won't work.
Cutrone and Spencer Leonard are sitting in the
It won't work. Pinochet will come and kill Allende in his office, rightly so.
Mhm.
Rightly so. Right. Because there was a lot of like street turmoil in Chile.
Yeah.
The working class was divided in Chile.
Yeah, the truckers.
Yeah, and the working class, the middle class was, totally torn up. And the working class was not adequately organized to be able to take power. But also there's the question of take power in Chile. Okay, and where's that going to go? Right? Meaning, you know, was the working class in the metropolitan countries in a position to help them if the workers came to power in Chile, or were they not in a position to help them? Right? Do we want just Paris Commune over and over again? Is that what we want? We want martyrs? No.
You
By the way,
mentioned, go
there were
ahead.
socialists who were against Allende in Chile. There were ostensible socialists and communists also. Small groups, whatever. There was dissidents.
Right, yeah, there were.
Everyone didn't sign up with that, right? So, and there's a reason for that, right?
Well, they thought I mean, some of them thought he was basically a reformist, and
Well, of course he was,
yeah.
right? And so this is the thing. Like again, I know this history deeply, Like that's what I've spent the last 40 years doing, studying this stuff, you know, in high school and college and ever since. Like the actual history of concrete, real movements in all sorts of countries around the world. The movements and the parties, not just the events that took place,
Mhm.
but the deeper history of these organizations. And, certain things have become apparent in terms of what's needed and what was missing and what was absent and, what conditioned things. And so again, this is not an easy road, nor is it a shortcut. It's not like a direct. Another way that I'd put it is this is a multi-step or multi-stage proposition. Right. There's not a direct line between what we need to do now and achieving socialism. And there will be crises along the way, hopefully, that are real, that aren't just kind of burnout failure type setbacks. Um,
Like
you know,
Bernie, like Occupy.
absolutely. Absolutely. So this is the thing. I mean, this is the other thing that history has taught me, which is that the last 100 years is about the left moving on from one thing to the next with a kind of instant amnesia,
Hmm.
with a kind of instant memory holding. Um, and that's a problem, and it's because there hasn't been enough in practice to discipline them, keep them on task.
Hmm.
Been too easy for people to be thrown off task because there hasn't been enough practical engagement to really discipline them and keep them on task. So that's what I'm interested in doing,
Yeah.
creating those conditions
Well, yeah.
where you can, where you are engaged in such a way that you can't be thrown off very easily. Right? Because the smallest thing now divides the left into
That's
two
hard to do.
poles.
It's real easy to get triggered.
Well, because they're petty bourgeois radicals. That's in the nature of petty bourgeois radicalism. What did Lenin say? They constantly oscillate between enthusiasm and despair.
Mm. Hmm.
What I can say, kids, I've been doing this for 40 years. I've had my ups and downs. I've had my bouts of enthusiasm and despair, but not like that. Not like that. Meaning, we got to get to, like I said, practically, because not everyone's going to be able to do it at an intellectual, theoretical level. So, at a more practical level, to be organized in such a way that they can stay the course, right? That it's not, that we're not just slaves of the capitalist fashion in politics, the news cycle, the whatever, whatever they want to get us upset about. We have to have a grounding in reality that can resist that.
Well, I'm certainly guilty of falling for that the libtardism, as Danny has put it before. Um,
Right.
it gets
Right.
me. It's especially certain topics. Um,
Yeah,
you meant go
like this
ahead.
too. It's not like only the left, right is like this too.
Oh yeah,
But I feel like insofar the left and the right are both like this, it's because the left is the right.
it is.
Yeah.
You mentioned
So we got
square
to be
one.
very stoical.
Yes, that's the hard part.
Go ahead.
You mentioned square one and how we were there and we need to really own that we're at square one and work from square one. Uh, but that hold on, where's my so what does it mean to say there are workers but no working class currently? Because this seems to confirm,
That's
yeah,
a hard
because
one.
well, and because it seems to confirm or echo our mutual friend
Hmm.
Dave's formulation from Theory Underground about the post-class fractured mass.
Sure.
Right, and his idea is that we can't really put Humpty back together again. That era is gone. Capital has moved on. We need to find another way forward that matches today's conditions instead of trying to retrying failed strategies of bygone era. Like Marx was writing and Lenin was writing for a different time when workers were organized in a
That's
certain
true.
way, and that isn't true now, and that we're reaching back for something that's impossible these days.
Well, it's true that we can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. That's true. And it is true also that there won't just be a repetition of like Marx's time or Lenin's time. The way that I think of it is we need something like Marx, something like Lenin. In terms of the moment that they met, but also we have to say, look, Marxism failed. Leninism failed. Stalinism failed. Trotskyism failed. It's just done. That's just done. So nonetheless, and the working class was able to achieve some things. So there was a phrase at a platypus panel, Leo Panich, editor of the Socialist Register,
Canadian.
Canadian, yeah. Who, was personally acquainted with in a number of contexts. He said that roughly 1870 to 1920, those 50 years, is the first and only time that the subaltern, but the working class, but the subaltern more broadly, was organized into a social and political force of its own. That's simply true. Now, was it just a coincidence that that's also when Marxism gained traction and became a mass political ideology? I mean, maybe, but I think there's more than a coincidence there. I think that tells us something about some kind of hold on truth that Marxism in its original historical phase had. We need something like that, but we're not starting there. Meaning, I always like to point out Marx and Engels didn't invent socialism and communism. They came in after that was already constituted for several decades before they arrived on the scene. And then they dealt with that reality. And, it took then another generation to really become a mass political ideology in the late 19th century. So Marx and Engels themselves were not leaders of a mass movement, But then Marxists who followed them did become leaders of a mass movement. And again, maybe it's the only time ever in history, the first and only time ever in history, that the subaltern were organized as a social and political force of their own, meaning not a social and political force for other people,
Mhm.
for nationalists, for capitalists of various kinds. Right? So, if we consider that, which I think is worth considering, are we going to repeat that history? Not exactly, no. No. And there is a formidable cost that we have to pay for the failure of Marxism, which is that uh, it's like an ideological obstacle that people are like, oh, didn't people try that already?
Right. Well,
Didn't
they
that
would say the
fail?
same thing about socialism too, would they not?
Sure, of course. Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, look, my article is very specific. I hesitated initially when it was solicited. I was like, I don't know if I want to write such an article. We have the 11Cs from, 2016. Because it's okay, who am I addressing with this? What is this for? Like, this is gonna be addressing like the working class? It's gonna be addressing workers. Or if there are workers, are actually would be socialists. They are socialist intellectuals, a socialist intelligentsia. And that's why I start tongue in cheek with a kind of preacher.
Hmm.
Like, oh, hear me, people, hallelujah, that, I've got the good news, the day for socialism has come. Because, yeah, I'm preaching to the converted in a way, or preaching to the socialist intelligentsia. Like, what is it that we would be socialist intellectuals? What is it that actually has to be done? What do we have to get involved in? Right. So I knew that that's the audience. Look, it's in sublation. Like, who's the audience? It is intellectuals. That's what we're talking about. Regardless of class background, trust fund babies, abject, multi-up, working class people, doesn't matter. The socialist intelligentsia. That's who I'm addressing. So this is not how you go and organize workers by handing this out as a leaflet or something. No, right? Like that's not the point. But the point is, maybe there's another aspect of reality that you haven't considered that's kind of invisible and you haven't even thought to look there. And then the caveats that attach to that, in terms of, again, now getting back to your point about the working class and workers. So there are workers, but no working class. This is a play on my old mentor, Adolf Reed. He said there are leftists, but there is no left.
Hmm.
And I always thought, well, that's certainly true. But there's actually a deeper problem even than that, which is that when Marx and Engels addressed like the proletariat, it was already in large measure constituted as a social and political movement in England and France. There was Chartism, there was socialism, there was something beyond utopian socialism. There was already proletarian socialism in the 1840s in France. And certainly there was proletarian socialism in Britain. So there was a working class. Whereas now, and the question is, how and why is it the case? Like Dave McCarricker, post-class fractured mass. How and why did that come about? Did that happen because of changes in technology? Is it because of scattered site production and offshoring? Like, why? How did that happen? Because no, actually, there was a working class in the early to mid 19th century that was not based on the massive factories that we think of in the era of high Marxism. So, and people worked long hours. They worked 7 days a week. They worked 12 to 14 hours a day. I mean, like, yet they were still able to organize themselves.
So really, we're just imagining this. There was this perfect set of
Conditions.
conditions for, large factories with large amounts of workers who were all had the opportunity to work together and organize in these with socialists coming to talk to them and handing out pamphlets and
Yeah, no, that didn't. It never happened quite like that. That's not how it happened. Again, I've actually studied this history. That's not how these movements were constituted. So, but again, we'd have to come in with a more heterodox attitude. In other words, we have to put aside all of our assumptions that we might have on, you know, the working class and what it would take to organize. It's really much more experimental and exploratory at this stage, meaning we have to find out what the possibilities are, what the necessities are, right? And what would suit the task in the long run, which we can't necessarily know. We have to sort of engage it. So I don't think that the working class is worse off now in terms of its capacities to organize. I don't. I also I think there are examples in other parts of the world besides like the United States, Canada, Western Europe. There are examples of people organizing themselves under very adverse conditions. So yeah, this is a fantasy excuse. It's an excuse. I think it's an excuse that we give ourselves.
to do
And
nothing.
it's to do nothing or to do what we're doing, which is like get bent out of shape about whatever the capitalist media is blaring at us today, right? And then argue with each other about it, about how we feel about it, right? So, I mean, so I think again that, this is what Dave got from a course that I taught at Theory Underground on Marxism. So we read the 18th Brumaire was the first thing that we read. And I think it kind of blew their minds. And then they got attached to this idea of like, oh my God, the homologous magnitudes, the sack of
The sack
potatoes.
of potatoes.
That's the working class today. And it's like, yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. But that's also the working class by default, or that's the workers by default.
Hmm.
Because Marx was talking about how the organized working class was defeated, struggled, and was defeated in 1848 and at other points in the Second Republic between 1848 and Louis Bonaparte's coup d'état. The working class had been actually actively disorganized. Like it was attacked. It was, they were deported to the colonies. They were massacred on the streets. Like they were broken up by police spies. So he was talking about the prior existing organized working class being absent from the scene, and then the voters who elected Louis Bonaparte being the peasants, some of whom were kind of proletarianized, some of whom were more petty bourgeois, but they're all like a sack of potatoes. But the working class is a sack of potatoes too, without its self-organization. Like everyone's petty bourgeois. Like this is the other thing that people need to just get. There's only haute bourgeois and petty bourgeois. There's small bourgeois and big bourgeois. That's all that there is. That's not workers and capitalists. Workers and capitalists is a different thing, and in many respects, workers and capitalists has to be made to happen. That division has to be made to happen.
We need to constitute it.
Need to constitute it. It's there in Marx's Poverty of Philosophy, his Critique of Proudhon in 1847. It's, that the capitalists only become a class when they're facing the working class as a
Hmm.
class.
Right.
Otherwise, they're more internally divided than they are united, right? And then only in response to a united capitalist class does the working class really unite in a certain way,
Right.
right? So we are before all of that, meaning there is no united working class forcing the capitalists to become united as a class, forcing the working class to constitute itself even further as a class. We're not there. And I guess it's easy to assume that, that's just impossible. that it's like anthropologically impossible, that we're a new like psychological type, that I don't know, social media has just like, you know, subjected us to the matrix or something, we're all in the pods, and so we just can't. No, this is an illusion. And it's born of, I would say, we're living with the cost of several generations of bad leftism.
Hmm.
We pay a price. So we have to unlearn a lot. We have to have an open mind. We have to, I always like to joke about my Socratic method, so what does Socrates say? The beginning of wisdom is knowing that you know nothing. Yeah, we know capitalism is a problem. We know that in the past there was a socialist movement based in the working class that was able to organize itself.
Hmm.
We know that. But besides that, we don't know much. We're deep in dystopia. That's the other thing. We're not waiting for dystopia. We're deep, deep in dystopia. We have to sort of imagine what would people several generations into dystopia, how would they have to struggle? That's where we are. That's who we are. We're people who are several generations into dystopia, where everything valuable about historical knowledge has been memory hold, and where we've just been given this crazy propaganda lie. Or another way of putting it, I watched Man in the High Castle. If the Nazis won,
Hmm. Hmm.
you know, what would people know about anything, about history? They'd know nothing. Well, guess what? The Nazis basically won. Like, that's what people need to understand. That's not an alternate timeline. That's our timeline because the socialists were defeated. Again, that's like a thought experiment. That's more of a theoretical thing. For would-be socialist intellectuals, we have to understand that we're completely lost. Completely lost. We're in complete darkness. Bertolt Brecht, I'm living in the dark ages.
What do you make of, what have you seen from the left in terms of response to this article?
Not much, some befuddlement. I think that in some ways people think that they've heard it from me before already. And so I'm not sure how close they're paying attention to the article per se. Meaning this is a different kind of writing that I've been doing at least earlier this year and maybe in recent years, but generally, a little bit different than my usual style of writing, but still a kind of a thought piece and something that seems destined instantly for the archive, right? Meaning it's a message in a bottle, to use an Adorno expression.
Right.
That it is that, meaning that even though it isn't, it still needs to be read that way. Like, okay, you're cast away on an island from a shipwreck or a plane crash, and then something washes up on the beach and you read it and you're just like, where is this coming from? That's the way it should be read. It should be read as, where is this coming from? It can't be read as, well, you already know Chris Cutrone where he's coming from. No, where is this coming from? Right? So really read it, really puzzle over it. Because, I'm not meaning to give a puzzle. I'm not, but I realize that it is a puzzle.
It's both, in some ways, it's both clear and unclear because you talk about, well, we don't really know what some of these meanings are, and we're going to go into this without agreeing on what to do.
Well, we can agree on certain things. We can agree on what to do in terms of, again, what empowers the working class.
Right. And what, I mean, some people don't agree on that. There is.
Well, they don't agree over whether that's a good idea or not,
Hmm.
right? Meaning, yeah, I'm sure there are a lot of people who think the workers shouldn't have guns because they'll just shoot themselves or shoot each other, right? So they'll disagree with empowering the working class per se because they really don't want the workers to have power, even just in terms of everyday life.
In your article, you brought up the abortion example.
Yeah.
So this is kind of a good one.
Yep.
I mean, the
Yep.
Bolsheviks campaigned on legalizing abortion, but
Sure.
you said that, and I agree that any socialist organization or party would have to include people with on both sides of that debate. So how do you
A
square
priori
that?
exclude anybody. Well,
Right.
the way I'd square it is, yes, like of course, like in some ways all the old positions are valid, sure. However, that's not the way people experience it. Meaning everyone I know who might, throughout my life history, because I actually don't know anybody now, really, um, who would be for criminalization of abortion. But I did know people. I did know like my Italian grandmother, my mother's mother. She participated in anti-abortion protests. She went and blockaded with her fellow Catholic Church Rosary Society ladies an abortion clinic, you know? And, so um, you know, people think they confuse law and morality in the abstract, meaning they think that a law should be passed in to send a moral message.
Hmm.
And they don't think about it beyond that point. But if they thought about it in more practical terms, they might be in favor of abortion being illegal, but they might want someone they know to be able to get an abortion if they need to. Right? In other words, the difference between a sin and a right. That's the way that I put it. In other words, do people have a right to reproductive freedom? Yes. Is it a sin to have an abortion? Who knows? Who knows? That's just a separate question. Do you have a right to commit a sin? Yes, you do. Every religion will tell you that. There's a difference between sin and crime. There's a difference between morality and law. But unfortunately, capitalist politics plays on people's moral sentiments
Hmm.
to garner electoral support for passing laws. But guess what? The workers do what they need to do, right? The workers may or may not vote for a pro-abortion or anti-abortion candidate, but when in a pinch, they're gonna, if they need to get an abortion, they're gonna find a way. And they might agonize over it as a moral decision, but they're gonna do what they have to do. That's reality, right? Reality is not this media game of playing on people's specious moral sentiment that really have nothing to do with anything. Right? So yeah, you could say, "Oh, well, the capitalists could criminalize abortion, but they and their families will always be able to get an abortion." That's true, right?
Hmm.
But then that just leaves it in the realm of moral hypocrisy, right? Like that's not the point, right? And also, are we in a position where the working class is a social and political power to be able to affect whether abortion is legal or illegal? No,
No.
we're completely helpless to whatever like courts decide. It came to a Supreme Court decision back in 1973 and now. It's a Supreme Court decision. The workers have no power over that whatsoever. They never will. They will never. Because what? As an electoral constituency for the Democrats, who promised to pass laws and appoint Supreme Court justices? Again, we've tried that. That's my whole life. My abortion was a live political issue my whole life. It amounted to nothing. Absolutely nothing. We gotta cut that shit out. I'm certainly not gonna debate any leftist on abortion. Fuck no. In other words, yeah, I think it should not be criminalized. It should be what Bill Clinton said. It should be, legal, safe, and rare.
Hmm.
Meaning contraception should be better. You shouldn't need an abortion. It should be rare, meaning people should have as much freedom over their bodies to not need a surgical intervention, which, is dangerous. It is, even when it's legal, even when people are well trained in it, which doctors are not. Like, like very few doctors are actually trained to perform abortions now,
Hmm.
right? You know? So, like again, but did they uphold that? Did they uphold it? No, they
No.
didn't. And they can't. And they won't. And anyway, not our concern. Meaning, what do we have to do that's not dependent on what they do?
Right. Their system is not for us.
It's not. Well, it's not for us as socialists. I mean, in other words, it might be for the workers as wards of state.
Right.
So, back in the day, when you have a mass socialist movement, the working class, guess what? You get the bourgeois professionals to join. You have doctors, you have lawyers, you have people. And then you can do things like provide these services independent of the state, independent of the capitalist funded hospitals. That was done. That has been done.
And
It
the
never even occurs to people.
instead today the left movements make demands are make rights out of demands from the state. You will provide us with access to this. You will provide us for funding for this.
And because there's like a philosophical debate over, and then, like what's a right, what's a privilege? Is healthcare a right? No, it's a good, right? It's a commodity. It's not a right, because you can't guarantee people's right to be healthy. No, you can only provide them goods and services that might or might not help be healthy, right? There was a time in which it was understood that the things that exist for capitalism. They exist for the purposes of capitalism. That's how and why they exist. And that includes the state and its laws.
And that's not
None of
understood
these
today.
things, it's not understood. No, no, no. People have a very kind of naive bourgeois sense. That's why they're petty bourgeois radicals, petty bourgeois Democrats. They want the people to have more of a say over the state and its laws. And it's like, yeah, that's great. But we're not talking about that. So I want to clarify a point, which is I'm interested in doing what other people aren't already doing. So there already are liberals, progressives, conservatives, whatever liberals. There are petty bourgeois, small d Democrats doing all sorts of things, making cases, demands on the capitalist state, suing, litigating, trying to pass laws. That's great. We need to attend to what's not already being done. Because that's already being done. Meaning, the whole question of like legality, illegality of abortion, that's being handled.
Leave that to the liberals.
Yeah. Socialists don't need to do that. We need to build up the power of the working class such that we could compete with the liberals over that kind of stuff. But we're not there. And we're not going to be there for a while. Right? We're not for them, we're not against them. We're trying to be independent of them, meaning not dependent on them. It's a hard one, but also there are things that are already being done. So there are, I was watching one of these Homeland Security people or immigration enforcement people complaining about how churches are, you know, doing things for illegal immigrants. And it's like, yeah, they are. That's right. They are. And, as long as that's happening, then, it's an enforcement problem. And it's like, yeah, that's kind of too bad. Meaning like you can't really do anything about it. And it would become politically dicey for you to try to stop the churches from helping the illegal immigrants. The socialist movement has to be in that kind of a position where the capitalist state was complaining about, but can't really do anything to
Right.
stop.
It would actually, yeah, they would,
It's
it's
like,
too risky
those
for them.
damn socialists, right?
Hmm.
Like, if only the socialists weren't causing us these problems, but they basically have to
Right.
accept.
And there was a time when the movement was strong enough that was a
Yep,
consideration.
that's right. That's right. And there are aspects of reality now that are like that, meaning, like the gangs exist, they are more or less accepted, meaning it's understood the police can't round up all the gangs, they wouldn't even want to. They can complain about them, they can fight them on certain things sometimes, but basically, the mafia exists, it's basically accepted, and then it sort of ends up colluding with the state. The state uses them, they use the state, they corrupt people, the
They
state
keep a
gets
kind of
involved in
order.
them. Yeah, they keep a kind of order. And socialists have to be in a position where, from a certain standpoint of the capitalist state or from capitalist civil society, it would be like, yeah, we can kind of coexist with these socialists. We wish that they weren't there. We really do. But they can kind of take care of some things that we don't want to be bothered with also. Because that's what people need to understand also, is that on the one hand, socialists might be seen as like a church. On the other hand, they'll be seen as a gang.
Yes. Well, and they were.
Yeah,
They were in bed
racketeering
with.
laws were used against them. That's right. Right. They were disqualified from election because there was like, this is a membership organization, not a political party. And membership organization means kind of, maybe legit, maybe not legit. Like always on the verge of being a gang or a racket, you know? Meaning like Scientology is bad, right? But is the state going to wipe out Scientology? No. Do they wish they'd go away? No. And if they stay in their lane, it's kind of like it's okay, you know? And it kind of doesn't matter.
Mhm.
Um, now obviously, organizing the working class for socialism, organizing working class social and political power would create problems and crises of the capitalist state. But we'd have to prepare to be able to deal with those crises that would be precipitated. Right. In other words, we don't want to get out ahead of ourselves where we provoke a crisis, forcing the state to act, or we're not in a position to deal with it, defend ourselves against it, handle it.
Right. We need the base first.
Yeah. And that's not where people are. People are in terrorism now. I mean, look, we're way down that highway.
Mangione.
Luigi Mangione, and there are many other examples. I guess your petty bourgeois radicals are going to do that shit. That gets you into the realm of morality. That is just not even the point. It's not the point. It's not like, oh, is one CEO's life worth more or less than all the people they screwed over through the health insurance company? It's just so, why are we even talking about this? What does this have to do with the working class organizing itself as an independent social and political force? It doesn't. It does not.
Because they are oppressed. They are oppressed and exploited, Chris.
That's why.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well,
It's the
you
oppressed fighting
know,
back.
right. And I have no doubt Luigi Mangione was oppressed, even though are his parents millionaires who run like nursing homes, who are part of the healthcare system, who are vampires in the healthcare system. I'm pretty sure like his family, I think that they run some nursing homes or something. It's like pretty stark. This will self-exclude a lot of people. Good. It will self-exclude the people who should be, and it won't exclude people who shouldn't be.
So the response to you online is
Oh,
a
people
kind
are
of
declaring
self-sorting.
themselves. Yes.
It's a self-sorting mechanism then.
It
The
is a little
uh
bit. I
the
wasn't really trying to do that. In other words, like I said, it's throwing the gauntlet down to a certain extent. It's making an appeal, but it's not really meant to like divide people.
no.
But then people, if they really just can't handle it, then what can you do?
Well, some of them, I think it's Johnny Socialism and Ruth Bader Meinhof on Twitter, a couple prominent leftists on
Oh my
Twitter.
God. So that's like Ruth Ginsburg plus Baader-Meinhof.
Yes.
Like if only Ginsburg had the Supreme Court justice, if only she had had her own terrorist posse on her side,
I guess so. I
then
guess
that would
so.
be the magic formula, right? Supreme Court justice plus street terrorism. That sounds good, right? That's how you get shit done. Ooh. Do you know what I mean? It's almost like a perfect announcing, like, look, I ain't talking to you. You're not, you know?
Right. Well, I mean, they excluded themselves immediately by one of them saying, uh, they just called you right wing and listed some things you'd done in the past, and
Mm,
you don't need to even bother reading this because it's Chris Cutrone. And the other one said, well, I read a bit of it, and I saw this part about abortion, and I didn't agree, and so the rest must have been stupid. And
perfect.
yeah, so there you go. And a lot of the comments were like that. And yeah, I got a lot of views. But and then
Mm,
there seems to have been some indirect responses as well from
uh-huh.
there's some talk now of uh, a deep dive on left intellectuals um, from Daniel Tutt and Varn, which
Derek
may or
Varnya.
which may or may not be some kind of response to.
Response.
Mhm.
It's in the same, look, we know each other. And so, I've been talking about things for a while. And so it might predate the publication of this article, but it's more than coincidental. It's, serendipitous. It's, it's something that I talked to Daniel about, Daniel Todd, and also to Derek about, meaning, of course, I'd love for them to get involved in this project. Of
Mhm.
course I would. But I'm not going to debate like Nietzsche with them or something, or whatever, I'm just not, meaning that's not the topic. That's not the agenda. It's not the topic of conversation. I want to talk about this. Okay, I think that the way I put it to Daniel Tutt in private discussion, I just said, really the question now is, what are you going to do with the rest of your life?
Hmm. Is he going to keep doing this?
Yeah,
Or
you're going to keep doing like podcasting and the fine details of Alain Badiou, or are you going to be really useful to actual working class socialist movement?
he's a smart guy. He could be useful.
Of course, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, no doubt. And so again, it's throwing down the gauntlet, but it's not meant to like put people off. It's
Right.
not. They need to struggle with this, I guess. Struggle with this idea, struggle with this task. I see ourselves like the Russian example is not great to refer to, but it nonetheless is there. People know some references there. When Plekhanov and Zazulich like broke from the Narodniks, became Marxists, did something else, started the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party when they formed the Emancipation of Labor Group, right? And they broke with the Narodnik, Tolstoyan socialists or whatever, right? Christian socialists. They're Slavophilic socialists. When they read Marx and are like, yeah, actually, probably we should be doing something else. Right. And then, the party didn't really form for almost another 20 years. That's where we are now. That's who
That's
I'm
where we
talking
are.
to. I'm Engels talking to would-be Plekhanovs and Zazuliches. Do you want to break with this shit and do something else? Do you want to start something that you won't live to see to fruition? You won't, but you will serve the cause nobly nonetheless. And I certainly won't be there, right? I'll be long gone, but, like I said, more like
If
Engels.
you're lucky, maybe you'll be remembered because some people
Maybe,
will have listened to you.
maybe. Um, I mean, it's an unfortunate position to be in. I kind of feel like I feel like somewhere between a Christopher Lash and a Hal Draper, you know, um, the people who like kind of went through the experience of the 60s New Left, but were bitterly disappointed by it and were a little bit older, were like mentor type figures and were burned.
Hmm.
You but we still remember them. We
Yep.
do still remember them, right?
Lash has had a revival.
Lash has had a revival,
So
and
is Draper a
Draper
little
is
bit.
always there. Yeah, so Draper is there too. And so that's, I don't. you know, I want to be something more than that.
Right.
But if that's what I'm consigned to under more impoverished conditions, and so maybe I'm necessarily, gonna leave a little bit less clear of a legacy, maybe. I don't know. I'm not sure, but uh so be it if that's the fate I'm consigned to. I don't want to be the scold on the fading millennial left or a kind of eccentric, figure for the Zoomers because that's what Draper and Lash were. For my generation, for Gen X, it was hard to place them. It was like, oh, where's that coming from? Okay, that's kind of interesting, but I don't know how to fit this into things.
Hmm.
When I read Lash and Draper when I was 20, which is 35 years ago.
What's your call to
Yeah,
action?
I would say, okay, so first of all, there's the Campaign for a Socialist Party. Now, could we immediately absorb like a mass influx of people who are interested? No. But can we coach some people? Yes. And call to action. Um, First of all, people need to consider whether they're ready to embark on a totally different path than they've been on. In terms of people who have some maturity now and who have some experience and some knowledge that might be useful, some skills, some talents. In terms of very young people, right? Again, counseling patients. I think counseling patients to older people might be easier than counseling patients to younger people, maybe, right? So, it is a cadre building exercise. Of course it is. How could it not be? In other words, we don't want to burn people out. We don't want to recruit people and burn them out. We don't want a revolving door. We want people to get involved who are going to be in for the long haul. Who are, I think I put it in the article, some oath to this task of
Blood
socialism.
oath.
Yes. Meaning, commit yourself. And, but also, let's see what people can do, what they can do. Meaning not like, you know, I know the sectarian left. I know the demands that they place on people. No, not like that. It's not like give 20% of your income, be under party discipline orders, where the organization gets to tell you what job you can have or where you can live. Nothing like that. Because we're not trying to burn people out. It's going to be a slow burn. It's going to be a slow roll, really. It's going to be, it's going to take some time. So people can do what they can to learn to become organizers or to serve some other support ancillary role. And again, commit to, more than the capitalist election cycle, certainly more than the news cycle, but more than the capitalist election cycle. In other words, can you commit to this for more than 4 years, for more than 6 years, for more than 8 years? Can you foresee being able to do that? Like I said, I think that that's a proposition that's easier for someone who's more mature to consider rather than someone who's like 20. Right? Although I can tell you when I was 20, I was ready to sign on for a lifetime commitment. And guess what? I did, and I'm still here.
It's possible it can happen.
Yes.
Well, I mean, that's true. They don't have the patience, but they have the most time, the young, and they have the most motivation
Sometimes they have
sometimes.
time. Yeah. Motivation, yeah. Energy, yeah.
Energy, yeah.
Energy. Um, but you know, yeah, when I was 20, I wanted my marching orders and I was willing to commit. I was like, yeah, like in other words, what little I knew about history, I was like, yeah, you know what? Actually, yeah, it's gonna take time and I'm in it for the long haul, you know? And I knew something then, but I knew not a lot less than I know now. But I knew enough to know, okay, this is not something that I'm going to be satisfied by in terms of results in any immediate appreciable time.
Right. The people who sign up for
Nonetheless,
this are have to go into it with the idea that they are not going to reap the benefits of the work they put in.
there's that. But also, that and again, I would say, my experience with platypus, I think that this is a very different thing. However, whatever organizational skills I had to bring to bear there, it was also to make it sustainable, which it has been. Platypus is, 20 years now. And so it is sustainable without like excessive, without like personal sacrifice, without like that,
Hmm.
but really sustainable. Um, and we're going to be thrown a lot of curveballs by the capitalist political world. So just knowing up front that it's not about that. I mean, we were talking about the 30s, right? So what about the people who were the underground under the Nazis, who were the communists, the socialists, the Stalinists, the Trotskyists, the anarchists, who were still there under the Nazis through the whole period, you know? Right. So it does not matter what happens in the capitalist political realm. It does not matter. We have to be there through it all. This can be done. It has been done. It will be done.
Will be
Will it be
done.
done by socialists? Or will it only be done by Islamists or whatever? Will it be done by socialists? Because it will be done. There will be people who do this, who
Someone's
sign
going to
up.
do it, so it might as well be socialists.
That's right.
Okay,
Because
that's maybe that's a good place to leave it.
absolutely. Thanks, Anne.
Okay.
It's cool.
Thanks everybody for watching.